Thank you.
Gee, that's swell photography.
Mention the names Arthur Stanley Jefferson and Laurel Hardy to a cinema-adoring crowd, and you'll get countless reactions in return. A few may scratch their heads, others may fumble with their ties and grin nervously. If you're very unlucky, someone will start to cry. But mention the names Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, and those reactions will become associated with the characters they know and love. These were the names that made them famous, and still conjure up images today. Laurel and Hardy. Popular, but not populist. They appealed to the masses long after they hung their derby hats on life's wooden hat stand for the very last time. Clowns, which is essentially what Laurel and Hardy are, have their roots in every form of culture, reaching back further than you can throw a custard pie. Even if you had a custard pie throwing machine, you'd never hit the very first clown. There are references in the Bible to clowns, and we do know that Greeks and Romans used them as popular forms of entertainment, right through to court jesters of yesteryear and stand-up comedians of today. Probably the greatest of all English clowns, aside from Charlie Chaplin, was a thin, wiry fellow called Dan Leno, who was plying his comedy towards the end of the 19th century. This was at a time when Queen Victoria was head of the royal family. Stan Laurel cited Leno as one of his major influences, and it's easy to see why. He was a past master at being a female impersonator and originating the comedy cry, which was so beloved of Stan Laurel himself. He was also, towards the end of his life and career, partnered with a rather portly gentleman called Herbert Campbell. They were a roaring success, and it's easy to see echoes of them in the teaming of Laurel and Hardy. Humour is an endless recycling of original ideas, which surely makes it the most environmentally friendly of all art forms. So, let us look at two of the most successful clowns in more detail, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. Their public and private life ran along parallel lines and frequently crossed over. We shall examine the public persona that came alive on the silver screen with the private person that lived in the real world. We begin at the very beginning. In the town of Ulverston, deep in the heart of Lancashire, England, stands a little terraced row of houses called Argyle Street. They are unchanged since they were built many years ago. In the third house along, there is a plaque that reads, "Stan Laurel was born at this house, 16th of June, 1890. It was his grandmother's house, and Stan came into the world crying, an early sign of one of his most famous trademarks. He was Arthur Stanley Jefferson back then, born into a family of famous theatre folk. His father, A.J. Jefferson, was a producer, actor, and playwright who ran the Jefferson Theatre Group. One of the actresses therein was the beautiful Madge Metcalf, who became AJ's wife. Because of a dip in AJ's fortunes, it was her parents that they were lodging with when Stan was born. 2 years after Stan Laurel was born, across the other side of the world at 125 South Hicks Road, Harlem, Georgia, USA, Oliver Hardy came into existence. He weighed an impressive 14 pounds at his birth on the 18th of January 1892. He was christened Norval after his mother's maiden name, but would later add the Oliver in homage to his father, who had died when Ollie was only 18 months old. His father came from English heritage, claiming to have been a direct descendant from the famous Hardy who stood by Lord Nelson's side during battle. The very same one who, perhaps, when faced with the famous "Kiss me, Hardy," quote, looked round at his watching shipmates and said to his commanding officer, "Well, here's another nice mess you've gotten me into." Oliver Hardy Sr. had been married before to Cornelia E. Magruder, who died in 1888, leaving him with 3 children. He then married Emily Tant, a widower herself with a brood of 4. Oliver Hardy Sr., very much like A.J. Jefferson, was a man of wealth and standing who, in the later years of his life, lost his fortune and had to rebuild it. Whereas A.J. Jefferson did this by selling his string of theatrical venues to manage the famous Metropole Theatre in Scotland, Oliver Hardy Sr. sold his expansive farm and livestock to manage the large Turnell Butler Hotel in Madison. The strange parallel between Stan and Ollie's fathers doesn't end there, as little Oliver was born in the house of his mother's parents, away from his father, just like little Stanley. It is the formative years of Stan and Ollie, much like any developing child, which shaped and fashioned their adult lives. In 1905, Stan relocated with his family to Glasgow in Scotland, where his father had been running the Metropole Theatre since 1901. He wasn't a studious child and preferred the smell of the grease paint to the learnings of the classroom. It was in 1906 that Stan made his first tentative steps on stage. His father, A.J., wanted his son to follow him into theatre management and so-called serious theatre, but after witnessing Stan's comedy turn at Britannia Theatre's Amateur Night, he encouraged his son to pursue this route instead. Oliver Hardy wasn't a studious child either. A stint at Georgia Military College during the years 1906 to 1907, where he had to endure all kinds of taunts and jibes about his ample size, toughened his character. However, it was not a career in the military that appealed to Ollie. Blessed with an attractive singing voice, he would stop the teasing by breaking into song or telling jokes, and this does seem to be the stereotypical reason he became an entertainer. Picked on by bullies, the class clown deflects the insults by being funny and earns the respect of his classmates.
No time, take no time to stay outdoors and spoon. Shine on, harvest moon for me and my gal.
Stan, on the other hand, was never bullied at school, but his maternal grandparents were strict Methodists who would punish him for the slightest misdemeanor. Ollie's mother was also a hard taskmaster. When Ollie was 14, he had a maple leaf tattooed on his forearm, and when his mother found out, she took a horsewhip to the tattooist. Perhaps these domineering images stuck with Stan and Ollie, for it is the women in Laurel and Hardy's film life who are portrayed as harridans, always ready to scold and put down our two heroes. In 1908, Stan's mother died. Both Stan and Ollie lost an important parent at an early age, and this may have been another reason why they were always the entertainer, seeking affection, love and laughter from an audience of strangers. Did they feel they lacked something in their upbringing? Was this the reason that they both had turbulent love lives in later life?
At a time like this, you had to do that.
It was in 1910 that two significant career-defining events happened to Stan and Ollie respectively. Stan Laurel left England from Southampton Docks on the SS Cairn Rona with the famous Fred Carno troupe on a tour to the USA, whilst Oliver Hardy opened his own movie theatre in Milledgeville, Central Georgia. Another one of England's greatest clowns was headlining the Fred Carno troupe at the time of Stan's involvement. In fact, Stan would understudy for him many times. They would also share a cabin and lodgings on their voyage to and across the USA. His name was Charles Spencer Chaplin, soon to be known as plain old Charlie Chaplin. It is interesting to note that Charlie Chaplin makes no mention of Stan Laurel in his autobiography, pointing towards a self-centered, self-driven, self-determined young man who would stop at nothing to succeed. Stan would be happy to retell little anecdotes of their time together, whereas Chaplin would have little time for Stan after his initial success with Fred Carno. The show that they toured in the USA was called A Night in an English Music Hall. Charlie Chaplin was an instant hit, and it was here that he developed his comic timing, his athletic agility, and his put-upon yet proud little man, which would be such trademarks of his more famous creation, The Tramp. Stan did his own comedy turns, but it was Chaplin who initially caught the critics' eye. Feeling that he wasn't being paid enough money, something that seemed to trouble him throughout his career, Stan returned to England to set up his own comedy troupe. But after limited success, he was forced to borrow money off his older brother Gordon, who was managing the Prince's Theatre in London. In the years that Oliver Hardy ran the little cinema in Milledgeville, Georgia, he would be witness to some of the earliest and crudest of comedies. Central to these were the emerging Keystone comedy shorts, films of just 2 reels that ran for half the length of a standard movie. Keystone was a company set up and run by an early movie entrepreneur, Mack Sennett. Soon, his films would be made universally famous by the madcap and daredevil antics of the Keystone Cops, featuring a certain Fatty Arbuckle. Roscoe Arbuckle, to give him his full name, was a Keystone regular who played on his ample size and graceful dexterity, reveling in the nickname Fatty, a nickname that Ollie had been so cruelly taunted with during his years at Georgia Military College. Ollie himself remembered thinking, when he watched these early attempts at comedy, that he could be just as good, or just as bad, as those so-called comedians. In 1912, Stan Laurel returned to the Fred Karno troupe. Themselves like an early version of the Keystone Cops, a heady mixture of the traditions of pantomime, vaudeville and the circus. A night in an English music hall would return for another triumphant tour of America. Stan secured his pay rise and took his place in the company, understudying Chaplin and dreaming of the time when he could headline the act. But again, it was Charlie Chaplin who took all the curtain calls and all the best reviews. Ollie left the running of the movie theatre in 1913 to try his luck in the blossoming movie colony of Jacksonville, Florida. He began using his sweet singing voice to gain work at clubs and theatres, appearing as the Ton of Jollity. It was a name that played on his size and also played on his conscience. Ollie was never happy with his burgeoning girth, but, as with many comedians, put on a mask of happiness and humour to cover his personal demons. Though, in November that year, the happiness and humour were real, as he married a renowned Jewish pianist called Madeline Saloshin. It was also in 1913 that Stan Laurel left the Fred Karno troupe to strike out alone. This was because its main star, Charlie Chaplin, was offered a job with Max Sennett as part of his Keystone Company. In a telegram sent home to his brother Sidney, Chaplin says, "They are very funny. They also have some nice girls." As was to be a theme throughout his long, eventful life, Chaplin's heart ruled his head when it came to the opposite sex, only settling down when he was well into middle age. Charlie Chaplin would rapidly become a very big star, while Stan would struggle along, secure in the knowledge that he was every bit as good as his English counterpart. Stan's reason for leaving the Fred Karno troupe seems to have been twofold. Firstly, he sought the lead role that Charlie Chaplin had been given and was constantly refused. And secondly, the problem of money. Securing the lead role would have enabled Stan to demand more money. Striking out on his own, he believed he could do what Charlie Chaplin had done before him. Meanwhile, Ollie was about to beat his soon-to-be companion to the silver screen. He had signed up with the Lubin Film Company to make Outwitting Dad. He also made a new name for himself, Babe Hardy. Obviously inspired by Fatty Arbuckle, the Babe nickname came from a local Italian barber whom, because of Ollie's ample girth and chubby-cheeked face, always called him Nice a Baby. The name Babe stuck, and he would continue using it for the first few years of his screen career, and for the remainder of his adult life.
Well, I guess we'd better be going, eh? Come on, we'll...
You go ahead.
What's the matter? Aren't you going out with me?
I want to be alone.
Marrying a Jewish woman at a time when anti-Semitic feeling was rife in America, Ollie became distant from his Deep South roots and from his conventional mother. Taking a new name seems to have given Ollie a new lease of life. Although he speaks fondly of his mother in interviews given in later life, they hardly had any contact from the moment he left her behind to join the movie business. It's small wonder that Ollie always looked for love and stability in his married life, yearning for someone to comfort and look after him in much the same way as a doting mother would. Perhaps to bolster his self-confidence and protect him from the constant teasing about the way he looked. It's a common misconception that fat people are happy people. The jolly fat man stereotype is born from a need to appear comfortable within their own skin and fight off any criticism before it's even given.
No, I don't mean that. I mean he's crazy about you. He's going to marry you. Aren't you, Ollie? Go on, stop popping.
You want to marry me?
Well, that is, if you don't mind.
Oh, monsieur, you make fun of me.
No, he's not kidding. He's on the level. Aren't you, Ollie?
Why, certainly. I was never more sincere in my life.
After leaving the Fred Karno troupe, Stan would travel around the USA with his own variations. None of them was successful, and he barely popped his head up over the poverty line. The only alternative was to pop his head back up again in England. However, Stan persevered in America. Who can say whether this was his grim determination to succeed in the career he had chosen and to emulate Charlie Chaplin's success, or whether it was because of the First World War. Had he returned home, he was eligible for enlistment and surely certain death. This was a time when troops who popped their head up at the front line were just being used for cannon fodder for the enemy. Whichever way you look at it, Stan was struggling for his survival, trying to eke out a living, much like he would be in many of his later Laurel and Hardy comedies. Trying to regain his dignity and standing at a time when his life was at its lowest ebb. In 1917, Stan, like Oliver Babe Hardy, had a change of moniker. He had been appearing in a self-named act called the Stan Jefferson Trio, but after disbanding it, soon began working with Charlotte May Cuthbert. This was a woman who Stan fell head over heels for, on stage and off. She was performing under the name May Dahlberg, simply because she was still married to a husband in Australia, whom she had fled from at the start of the First World War. Because May and Stan began living as common-law husband and wife, Stan changed his surname and hers to Laurel. And so it was that S&M Laurel became a new vaudeville act, and were able to continue touring and living together without arousing suspicion. By 1917, Ollie had made well over 100 comedy films for a variety of hastily set up film companies. Whereas Stan learned his art of comedy from appearing on stage, Ollie mastered his craft by performing in front of the camera. Forever cast as the heavy, no pun intended, he found that the more weight he piled on, the more work he would get. Movies relied on stock characters and racial stereotypes, so the fat man was always in work. Especially one with such grace and comic sensibilities as Oliver Hardy. It was also in 1917 that Stan Laurel made his first film. It was titled Nuts in May, and sadly no longer exists. But it features Stan as a schizophrenic who thinks he's Napoleon. Dual personalities is a theme that Stan returned to again and again in his comedies. Maybe this is because he could see a dual personality mirrored in his life, on and off camera. The public and the private persona of an actor are generally very different, and Stan was no exception. By 1920, Oliver Hardy's marriage to his Jewish wife, Madeline, had reached breaking point. In documentation from the time of their divorce, Ollie declares that the marriage was a sham and that his wife acted in a cruel and inhuman way towards him. The picture painted of her is not a pretty one, but we must assume, as with any case of divorce, that lawyers hype the smallest detail to Orwellian proportions in order to appoint the blame. Ollie himself was no saint, as testimony against Madeline was made by a young lady called Myrtle Reeves. This is the same Myrtle Reeves who he was lodging with under the watchful eye of her mother, and whom he eventually wed. As soon as the final judgment of divorce was entered, Myrtle Reeves became the second Mrs. Oliver Norvell Hardy. The marriage took place on November the 24th, 1921, Thanksgiving Day. Ollie had a lot to be thankful for: a beautiful new wife, a burgeoning career, and a healthy bank balance. Both Stan and Ollie continued making films for independent movie companies until they were both signed up with Hal Roach in 1925. By 1925, Stan's common-law marriage was in trouble. At the time, he was signed to a contract with Joe Rock, in which he was allowed to develop and star in his own pictures. May Laurel insisted that she and Stan should always appear together in any film he made. She was clinging on to him like an overlarge barnacle on the underside of a ship. It was Joe Rock who finally paid her off, allowing Stan a newfound freedom in life and work. But, like Ollie before him, Stan took just a year to marry his second wife in the August of 1926, Lois Nelson. She did, of course, have the honor of being Stan's first legal wife. Again, like Ollie, he settled down into a domesticity that was redundant from their on-screen personalities. Hal Roach poached Stan from Joe Rock with just one thing: money. Stan, yet again, was concerned that he wasn't being financially rewarded for his work, and, as soon as a better offer was made, would pack his belongings and see whether the grass was greener elsewhere. So, within the Roach Studios, Stan would write and direct, whilst Ollie would continue acting. Their paths crisscrossed many times, until, in 1926, they finally bumped into each other on screen, brushed themselves off, and carried on down the cinematic road together. Duck Soup, their first official film as a double act, was overseen by Leo McCarey. Many people have claimed that they were the originators of the Laurel and Hardy pairing, but it seems most likely that Leo McCarey was the man who took them from having blind dates in a multitude of earlier films to an eventual marriage in this, their first teaming. He later went on to find greater fame writing for the Marx Brothers, even taking the very same Duck Soup title with him, and would write and direct scripts for Cary Grant, Irene Dunne, Bing Crosby, Harold Lloyd, and W.C. Fields. He was also on very friendly terms with Oscar, winning an Academy Award twice in succession. The public took to the pairing at once, and the polar physical opposite of each comedian was the bedrock on which lay their success. Maybe this was because, very much like Chaplin, they chose the costume of the everyman. The famous derby hats worn as a sign that these were respectable, intelligent men who had fallen on hard times. They aren't playing the village idiot or the cocky clown. They are ordinary members of the public who happen to have some very bad luck. Again, and again, and again. By 1929, Hal Roach had decided to move into talkies. The advent of sound created new careers for some and totally ended the careers of others. Charlie Chaplin, for instance, the so-called greatest clown, failed to make the transition, his comedy coming from a purely visual medium. Stan and Ollie had little trouble. Their voices matched the characters they'd created. Ollie's sing-song, deep Georgian voice, with its air of dignity, perfectly contrasted Stan's flat, high-pitched Lancashire tones.
I'm in love.
You don't tell me. Who is it?
The most gorgeous creature in the world. Georgia.
In December 1927, Stan and Lois Laurel were blessed with a daughter. She was named Lois too. But despite being a loving father, he was a bad husband, unable to resist seeking comfort from his wife in the arms of another woman. This may have had something to do with the birth and death in 1930 of a son, Stanley Robert Jefferson, who lived for just 9 days. It put a terrible, tragic strain on an already strained marriage. Ollie too was having trouble as Myrtle was drowning in the illness of alcoholism. She filed for divorce on the grounds that Ollie was never home, which is surely the last place he'd want to be when contending with the tantrums and rows of a drunken wife. They reconciled as soon as she agreed to stay in Rosewood Lodge Sanatorium to dry out. He too would find solace in the arms of another woman, a native southerner like himself, called Viola Morse. It is interesting to note how, around this time, the films that were making Stan and Ollie famous were almost always ones which relied on domestic chaos. Always married unhappily to beautiful women with sharp tongues and even sharper objects to hand, the role of the wife in Laurel and Hardy comedies is always portrayed as a mother figure, never treating the husband as an equal. More often than not, they are treated and behave like a small child. In films, Stan and Ollie can be children trapped in adult bodies. In real life, they had to grow up, and grow up fast. Perhaps the role of the strict and domineering wife came from Stan and Ollie themselves. Stan, more than Ollie, had a major input in making their successful early ventures, often sharing scripting and directing. He was initially raised by his maternal grandparents, who were strict Methodists, and had lost his mother at a very early age. Ollie was brought up by a very tough, determined and stern mother, who had to cope with being a widow, running a business, and looking after her young children. Both of them were used to tough love by females. It could explain why they both plumped for wives who were older than them and very strong in their nature. It was only as they got older and became more worldly wise that they settled down with very similar, loving, gentle women. Like a naughty schoolboy, it's always Stan who attempts to hit women in their films, and it's always Ollie who tries to respect them.
Look out.
This could certainly be an indication of the way their childhood influenced their adulthood.
Don't do that!
1932 was professionally a very good year for Stan and Ollie. To begin with, they won an Oscar. The Academy Award statue went to The Music Box for Best Short Subject. But, more importantly to them, they conducted a whistle-stop publicity tour of Great Britain. This was of greater importance because it supplanted in their minds the amount of love and affection that the general public held for them wherever it may be in the entire world. Initially, they weren't intending to travel together, as they only became close social friends in later years. But Stan wanted to visit his father in England, and Ollie wanted to visit the famous golf courses of Scotland. Myrtle Hardy tagged along, hoping to steer Ollie's affections away from Viola Morse. But Lois Laurel stayed behind, perhaps too weary of keeping up appearances. Amazed at their newfound fame abroad, Stan and Ollie were at odds as to why Hal Roach kept them on separate contracts. Yet again, the initial rumblings were begun by Stan. This recurring theme of money, rather like his succession of wives and mistresses, seems to carry Stan through life with a permanently worried air. It suggests a man of perfectionist traits, never happy with what he has and always trying to better it. He would be the same in constructing gags and routines, often recycling old ones in an attempt to make them bigger and better. It was he who suggested the Laurel and Hardy use their real names on screen. That way, nobody but them could own the rights to their name. They could leave a studio, as they did in their later movies, and their characters would go with them. (1933) was the year that Oliver Hardy filed for divorce, citing his wife's drunkenness. Stan's wife, Lois, also filed for divorce. But, as with any good Laurel and Hardy comedy, they all reconciled to try and live happily ever after. Sadly, it wasn't to be, as life is seldom like the movies. Rather like their most famous film, The Sons of the Desert, Stan and Ollie tried to take a vacation from their wives. Stan did this by jumping from Lois Laurel to Virginia Ruth Rogers, and Ollie did this by jumping from Myrtle Hardy to Viola Morse. In 1934, Stan married his mistress with somewhat indecent haste. He hadn't even been given a divorce from Lois Laurel, and, reflecting the comic absurdities inherent in the plots of his films, Stan had to remarry Virginia Ruth Rogers the following year to make it legal. So, does this make Virginia his second, third, or fourth wife? Who's counting? Well, perhaps his original common-law wife was, as May Laurel popped up to complicate matters in 1936, just as Stan and Virginia ran into difficulties and into the divorce courts. Stan and Ollie's matrimonial problems during the 30s are the subject of a documentary all of their own.
There's a nice pickle we're in.
Stan had barely been married a year to the newly named Virginia Ruth Laurel when she set out to divorce him, demanding more money than was hidden away in Fort Knox. May Laurel, his first wife in name alone, attempted to sue Stan for property rights. Whichever way you looked at it, Stan's worries about financial security were coming to fruition. Myrtle Hardy did the same to Ollie, dragging him through the courts during her divorce proceedings and demanding a sizable amount from her sizable husband. Throughout these shenanigans, it is amazing that they were able to concentrate on their career. But, as with all good clowns, the mask can be slipped over the frown and the smile can be gently applied. Another of their best full-length pictures was made during their matrimonial crises and was far removed from everyday life. Way Out West is the name of the film, and it's most likely where they both wanted to be. Stan and Ollie graduated into full-length movies in a tentative way. They both had grave doubts in overextending their characters. it's safe to say that when they moved away from their shorter efforts, their comedy started to slowly decline. This isn't to say they weren't as popular or as successful, it's just an indication of their gentle comedy being forced into a different structure. Virtually all of their earlier movies relied on one situation that escalated out of control until reaching a surreal or explosive denouement. To stretch this out over a whole movie would be like using cooked spaghetti as a rope swing. It might support you for a while, but would eventually snap, and you'd be unceremoniously dumped on your backside. Mind you, this could just as easily be attributed to their private lives. No sooner had Stan's courtroom antics reached an inevitable climax, he virtually took leave of his senses and married a Russian gold digger, notorious around Hollywood, called Vera Ilyana Ivanov-Shevalova. It was such a difficult name to pronounce, and my own tongue can vouch for that too, that Stan admitted he'd never been able to pronounce it during the vows. Of course, this being Stan Laurel, he married in such haste that the ceremony was interrupted by Virginia Ruth Laurel, who pointed out that they weren't actually legally divorced. So, Stan remarried his Russian temptress in a ceremony conducted in her native language and tradition. To make matters more complicated, he married her yet again a short while later, just to make sure he was actually wed. How many wives did Stan Laurel have now? Surely this could have been a popular parlour game of the time. By now, Stan had left Hal Roach, fed up with not being allowed a dual contract and more money with Ollie. As Ollie soldiered on to see out the remainder of his contract, he was partnered with Harry Langdon. Zenobia was the resulting feature, made without a sign of a derby hat, and was set in the deep south of Ollie's youth. It was an undignified flop at the box office. It was Laurel and Hardy the public wanted, not Langdon and Hardy. And so it was, in 1939, that Stan signed up again for Hal Roach. It was at the same time that he signed another important document too, a divorce from his Russian bride, who, to all intents and purposes, was an absolute nightmare for him to deal with. In the court proceedings during the divorce, she tried to convince the jury that Stan had indicated he would beat her and bury her alive. This all stems from Stan digging a hole in the back garden, and when his wife asked what the hole was for, he replied, "To bury you in." This was obviously a joke, but the wit was lost in translation, and Stan's Russian bride became increasingly more paranoid, violent, and vengeful. In The Flying Deuces, a feature-length film they made on loan from Hal Roach, there is a poignant bit of dialogue where Ollie is trying to commit suicide and Stan doesn't discourage him.
Well, goodbye, Ollie.
Goodbye, Stan.
Good luck.
Where are you going?
Well, I don't want to get my name dragged into this. What's this for?
Now, when I count 3, we'll both jump in.
What have I got to jump in there for? I'm not in love.
So that's the kind of a guy you are. After all I've done for you, let me jump in there alone. Do you realize that after I'm gone, that you just go on living by yourself? People would stare at you and wonder what you are, and I wouldn't be here to tell them. There'd be no one to protect you. Do you want that to happen to you?
I never thought of that. I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, Ollie. I didn't mean to be so dispolite.
That's all.
This seems to show a bleaker side to Stan and Ollie's relationship, And we must remember that Stan rewrote this script himself after initial reluctance to film it, showcasing their link as friends and how one couldn't function without the other, especially after death. When Ollie passed away much later, Stan would spend all of his time watching reruns of his old films and commenting on what a funny fellow Ollie was, as if he was lost without his best buddy. During the making of this film, and with a divorce newly granted, Oliver Hardy fell in love with the continuity girl, Lucille Jones. They married on March the 7th, 1940, and she would provide Ollie's continuity for the rest of his natural life. It was also in 1940, amongst the backdrop of the burgeoning Second World War, that Stan and Ollie left Hal Roach for good. Stan had hit the half-century mark in his life, and Ollie wasn't close behind. It was a time of change in the world at large, in their personal lives, and in their career together. Having left Hal Roach, the boys signed for 20th Century Fox. Unfortunately, before they signed the contract, they didn't read the small print. It was to be an unhappy coupling, much like Stan and Ollie's earlier marriages. 20th Century Fox allowed them no input at all into their films, and just required the brand name and their presence. Their much-loved characters were turned into bumbling idiot savants.
Dying with laughter. Go ahead.
No longer posing as children in adult bodies, these were adults acting like children. Coupled with the fact that their normal white-faced makeup was washed off and new realistic face paint was applied, they began to look old and tired. Gone too are the Laurel and Hardy regulars who made their films feel like a family affair. There is no sign of James Finlayson, Edgar Kennedy, Mae Bush, or Anita Garvin. All in all, their final films together are a slow decline into enforced cinematic retirement. As with most clowns, youth and agility are tantamount to their act. By the time they made their last film, Atoll K, in 1950, Stan was 60 and Ollie was 58 years of age. And sadly, it showed. When America joined the Second World War in 1942, it was obvious that audiences needed something to take their minds off the horrors and atrocities that came with it. Stan and Ollie were familiar and comforting faces, like a comfy pair of slippers. This meant that, although the quality of their 20th Century Fox pictures declined, their box office returns did not. This was a good thing for both Stan and Ollie. With past wives claiming maintenance and alimony payments, they had no choice but to keep working. In 1941, Stan had remarried Virginia Ruth Laurel, his official first wife, but alleged second wife, which makes his marriage life more complicated than is worth explaining. But this remarriage, like the Second World War, came to an end in 1945. However, the complications of Stan's other halves became settled once and for all in 1946, when he married his final wife, Ida Kitaeva Raphael, for the first and only time. So, at last, Stan and Ollie bucked the trend of their films and finally began to have a happy home life. With no film work on the horizon, Stan and Ollie accepted an offer to tour Great Britain in 1947. An audience hungry for laughter after 6 years of pain and heartache at the hands of Germany was eager to embrace their Lancastrian son and his Georgian best friend. With both doting wives in tow, they set out on a year-long trip. Huge audiences gave unlimited adulation and love to these aged clowns. Stan visited his 86-year-old father for the last time, and Ollie connected with Great Britain as if it was his adopted birthplace. After the success of the tour, Stan and Ollie made their final film together in 1950, Atoll K. However, in America it was recut and retitled Utopia. A European production, it shows a dangerously overweight Ollie, hardly able to conjure up any of the grace and dexterity that belied his size, and a seriously underweight Stan, stricken by prostate problems and severe diabetes, struggling to find any comedy in a patchwork quilt of a production.
I want to be alone.
Their final hurrah was another long and arduous tour of Great Britain. This time they were performing new material that Stan had written, using ideas from his father's comedy sketches all those years ago. A short tour began in 1952, where Stan was delighted to appear at the Metropole Theatre, Glasgow, the very same establishment that his father had managed when Stan was a little boy. A.J. Jefferson had passed away in 1949, so Stan felt his homecoming more keenly than ever before. In 1953, during the second leg of the tour, Stan and Ollie landed in the tiny fishing village of Cobb in Southern Ireland. Due to Ollie's restrictions on his work visa, he could only enter Great Britain via Ireland, so that's what they did. As they docked, the crowds were like a sea of people, carrying them into port on a tidal wave of emotion, and the bells of the church pealed out their signature tune, the Cuckoo Song. Stan and Ollie were both to recount the tale many times afterwards, both of them freely admitting it was the most amazing and emotional moment of their lives. Sadly, the second part of the tour was cut short as Ollie suffered a mild heart attack. His weight had ballooned to 350 pounds, and his movement was severely restricted. Doctors ordered him to reduce his ample frame at once. With their wives at their side, they returned to sunny Los Angeles in 1954. Later that same year, Stan and Ollie were surprised to be subjects of a This Is Your Life program. Throughout the live show, they look happy but perplexed. Stan admitted afterwards that he was concerned because A, they had no time to prepare any funny business to entertain the audience, and B, that they appeared for free. With Stan, being entertaining and being paid were always the two most important things in his life. But from this show came another offer of work. Hal Roach Jr., son of their original and best boss, offered them a TV contract for a series called Laurel and Hardy's Fabulous Fables. Stan set about writing the scripts, but after completing just one of the 4 shows, he suffered a stroke, and with orders to take life easy from now on, the TV shows never surfaced. In 1956, with fears about his heart, Ollie went on a crash diet and lost over 150 pounds. Friends were so noticeably disturbed by the change that he became a virtual recluse thereafter. It's ironic to think that, for a man so worried about what people thought of his size, it was his reduced form that caused the most upset. Perhaps because of this sudden loss of weight and the shock it must have been for his body, Ollie had a massive stroke a few months later. He died the following year, never fully recovering.
I'm talking to the gentleman. Will you keep quiet just a moment? And then I think that after a couple of weeks we might... What is it? You're standing on my foot. Oh, I'm sorry.
He was cremated, and the urn containing his ashes, kept in the Valhalla Memorial Park Cemetery, bears a simple inscription. It reads, Oliver Hardy, 1892 to 1957. A genius of comedy. His talent brought joy and laughter to all the world. The silver screen in the sky played host to the noble giant as he lay down to rest, probably drumming his fingers and looking exasperated, waiting for his partner's eventual arrival. In the years following Ollie's untimely death, Stan and Ida Laurel moved to a smaller, cozier home in the Oceana Apartment Hotel, Oceana Avenue, Santa Monica. It was here, instead of being the court jester, he became a king, visited by the court jesters of the day, who had all admired Stan and Ollie in their youth, and all felt they owed him a great debt. Danny Kaye, Dick Van Dyke, Peter Sellers, and Jerry Lewis, to name but a few. Here he would while away his hours, personally answering all the correspondence he received and watching repeats of old Laurel and Hardy movies on television. Stan Laurel died of a massive heart attack on February the 23rd, 1965.
What would you like to be when you come back?
Oh, I'd rather come back as myself. I always got along swell with me.
You can't come back as yourself. Now come on and stop wasting my time.
He had lived on after Ollie to see a resurgence of popularity in their famed double act, to receive a special Oscar for his contribution to comedy, and witness a permanent worldwide fan club, the Sons of the Desert, named after their spoof of Masonic rites. Stan was cremated and buried at Hollywood Hills Forest Lawns Cemetery. His plaque reads, Stan Laurel, 1890 to 1965, a master of comedy. His genius in the art of humour brought gladness to the world he loved. After 8 years of exasperatedly drumming his fingers and staring straight into the camera, Ollie is finally reunited with his beloved chum. Well, Stanley, he says as they enter the pearly gates, here's another nice mess you've gotten me into. The silver screen in the sky flickers dimly as Stan, not for the first time, begins to cry. As a postscript, it's interesting to note that certainly it's the children who respond the most to these two overgrown infants. In adulthood, they aren't quite as funny as they are when viewed through a child's eyes. Ollie is the grand, overbearing, pompous child who thinks that he knows everything and everything he knows is right. Stan is the whimpering, subservient child given to fits of alternating angry and tearful tantrums, but willing to be misled by his very best friend. As with childhood friends, they bicker, they banter, and they try to best each other with alarming regularity. Inside the world of celluloid, their childlike attitudes and antics never age. They both stayed perpetually simple and naive. Outside, in the hustle and bustle of the ever-changing real world, they became older and wiser and a little more cynical. We are all children at heart. After all, what's the point in being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes? That seems to be the fundamental ethos of Mr. Stan Laurel and Mr. Oliver Hardy. Long may they reign as the true kings of comedy.